Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! As you may know, hunting and fishing is very big in Alaska. I don't hunt and I'm very occasional fisher, as in a few times only. What's important to me and a very large portion of the hunting community is conservation efforts. I've always believed in consuming what you take and strictly adhered to conservation policies, limits, species, and so on. Alaskan outdoorsmen are very knowledgeable of these rules and regulations, and with good reason. The Fish and Wildlife Service is always watching and is very quick to levy huge fines and even imprisonment for outdoorsmen not following the strict policies. Outdoorsmen are also highly encouraged to report offending personnel in order to assist with compliance efforts. This story takes place about 15 years ago, so all the people here have likely moved or retired. We have built a new center in Alaska for the army. In the older center, there was a very large and imposing taxidermy display polar swiping at a seal. When I say large, I mean a polar bear that was at least 12 feet long. He was on all fours in a display that was about 16 feet by 8 feet by 6 feet. It was a massive display of a polar bear that was taken prior to the ban in 1972 Marine Mammal Protection Act. The army wanted this display in the new center, but since it was so large we had to leave it in the old center until the very last days. I did routine inspections of the new center at least twice a year where I would meet up with a head civilian. I loved my trips to Alaska because it was such a beautiful place. It should be noted that at the time my big boss was at the Pentagon and his last name was very unique. Let's just call him Colonel Polar Bear. On one particular inspection, about 3 years after the new center had been built, I noted that some new policy was coming down from Colonel Polar Bear's office that would affect all of our installations. The civilian kind of grumbled and smirked, then said okay. I could sense that he was irritated, but I didn't know why. I found out later why from one of the motor pool technicians. The civilians here were guard/reservists who wore a uniform 1 weekend a month, and also were Alaskan residents who had been in the state for many years. The uniformed personnel in charge of the facility and units were active duty and consisted of personnel from all around the country. The motor pool tech told me that prior to Colonel Polar Bear getting his lofty position, he was the active duty commander of the units here. He was not from Alaska, and he was not liked at all. He was racist, sexist, and constantly berated all those lower ranking than him. In one particular instance, he yelled at a female non-commissioned officer who was having trouble doing push-ups. He shouted inappropriate and sexist comments at her in front of all the soldiers. So Colonel Polar Bear was actually the commander at the time when we were finished building and were transitioning to our new center. The old center had been earmarked for demolition, which could not proceed until the final piece was removed. That's right, the aforementioned polar bear display. Unfortunately, we had no place to put it due to the size. Well, thankfully, Colonel Polar Bear offered up his big house close by where he could store it in the interim. He had the civilian workers carefully move it to an army truck and then carefully roll it into his house. Well, there was just one issue. Not only could you not hunt or shoot a polar bear in Alaska since the very early 70s, you cannot display them in a private residence without a license. Colonel Polar Bear, not being from Alaska, apparently didn't know this rule. After the truck and workers left the house, Fish and Wildlife officers arrived within hours to arrest Colonel Polar Bear. They placed him in handcuffs and walked him out of his house in view of all. This was thanks to an anonymous call. After all, Alaskan outdoorsmen have to follow the rules. After Colonel Polar Bear was released, He promptly called a mandatory meeting for all active and guard/reserve personnel to attend in formation and in uniform. As everyone stood at attention, red-faced Colonel Polar Bear yelled that he wanted to know immediately who had reported him to Fish and Wildlife. As a motor pool tech told me you could hear a pin drop, this went on for about 10 minutes until everyone was excused. Eventually, the Polar Bear display was placed in a large entrance to the news center. Unfortunately, I can't find any pictures of it online, and I never did find out who was the one that called Fish and Wildlife on the guy. So this happened many years ago when I was a teenager. We owned a very large German Shepherd called Rigo. He was the best dog ever, and I still think of him fondly. One summer's day, I was just returning home from taking him for his afternoon walk in a park. He was on his leash, and I was at the front door looking for my keys to get into the house. This is where the caring comes into the story. I hear a car pull up outside my house. Of course, I look around to see if it's someone I know. But no, it's a strange car. Anyway, Karen has parked right across the end of our driveway. She gets out and goes to the boot of her car and lets her poodle dog out. The dog jumps straight out, sees my dog, and runs up my drive, straight at me, barking and yelping. Well, of course, my dog goes into defense mode. He puts himself between me and the poodle. I scream at the Karen to get her dog. By now, the poodle starts attacking my dog, trying to get at me. Of course, there is a huge dog fight. I'm trying desperately to pull my dog away by the leash, but the poodle keeps attacking. The Karen is screaming at me and I'm screaming at her, and the dogs are really fighting now. In the end, I managed to grab my dog's collar and get him off the poodle. I have to kick at the poodle to stop it from coming back again. I get my dog into the house and go out to confront Karen. She has her poodle in her arms and is screaming at me that she's going to call the police to have my vicious dog put down. In the end, I told her to put her dog on a lead next time, and then I shut the front door. 2 hours later, a policeman shows up at our door. The poodle was dead. I was extremely upset by this, and I started crying. The policeman was here to see my dog and get my side of the story. When I explained what happened, he repeated it back. So your dog was on a lead on your driveway when she let her dog out of her car with no leash, and it was on your property that the dog fight took place? I said yes. The policeman said thank you and sorry to have trampled me, as it was clearly Karen's fault here. He also asked if my dog was hurt, as I could press charges against her if that's the case. I said that my dog was fine, and he left. The Karen then turned up an hour later screaming at the house from the street that we had to pay for everything, that it was our fault for having a vicious dog and so on. She would not stop screaming. I really felt sorry for her. I understood how upset she was at losing her dog, but by now half my neighbors were outside to see what was happening. In the end, someone called the police and she was escorted from our road. To this day, I still think of that poor little poodle and his irresponsible owner. Our dad has this habit where he would burn wood at a fire pit that was already built into the backyard when we moved in. But he would be talking loudly on the phone, which is also on speaker too, and very late at night. I wasn't fully aware that my dad was doing this. I had to work morning shifts and early morning classes, so I never noticed how late he was up and on his phone. It wasn't until one night, more like 3 or 4 in the morning, I woke up to flashing red and blue colors coming in through my window from the basement. I'm confused and just rolled over to go back to sleep because, as mentioned over, I didn't find out until after I got home that the neighbors had called the cops on my dad, cause he was burning wood in the backyard at 3 or 4 in the morning while speaking loudly on the phone. He was speaking with a relative in Laos, and you can hear animals squawking and barking through the phone. It didn't help that my dad was speaking in a very loud tone. I'm not surprised that all the loud voices as well as animal noises heard through the phone was enough to wake up the neighbors. So they called the cops and they spoke to our dad about disturbance early in the morning. I am sure it didn't sound like someone just casually burning firewood in their backyard while on their phone. It probably sounded like something else was happening. But he decided that he would start walking up early and just to talk on the phone with his speaker at full blast in the basement, just a few feet from my room, and he'd do this around 6 in the morning. When I have to get up at 8:10, I'm struggling to sleep, and he doesn't give a rat's butthole if I tell him not to do this. For some context, I live in a predominantly Catholic city where most people attend church on a regular basis. I, however, was not raised Catholic, so I kinda stand out a little bit from most people. This all happened about 2 years ago, when I was still in high school. My high school was just down the road from Tim Hortons, and across the road from that is a pretty large church. Only one in the neighborhood, I think. On Sunday, I decided to grab a coffee on my way to pick up a textbook for one of my classes. It was about 12, so church had just ended and there was a decently long line up for the Tims. I had been waiting in line for about 5 minutes when a woman walked up to me and started talking to me. It was a pretty normal conversation, but then she asked why she hadn't seen me this morning. I was confused since I had literally never spoken to this woman before. She told me that this Tim's belonged to the church. It actually didn't. I casually explained that I did not attend the church she was talking about. She gave me a confused stare, and she muttered then, "Oh," before walking away. Skip forward to Tuesday, I was once again at that Tim's getting some lunch when the same lady walks up to me and starts to berate me for being at that Tim's. "I thought I told you this Tim's is for the church only." "Yeah, but it's just a Tim's. Anyone can come in here if they want to though." "No, this Tim's is not for anyone who doesn't attend the church." "But the next Tim's is like 5 kilometers away." She continues to just yell at me in front of everyone in the Tim's. I was actually just going to leave to get lunch from my school. Then she dropped the Karen bomb. "If you don't leave the Tim's right now, I am going to call the police." And I decided at that moment to just stand still and let her call the cops. About 10 minutes later, 2 officers show up. The Karen tells them that I'm disrespecting her and disrespecting the church. I tell them that I'm just a hungry teenager trying to get my lunch. But the cops take her side, and they call both my parents and my school. My super awesome vice principal shows up and demands why he got a call from the police about one of his students. The officers tell him what's happening. My vice principal asks me if it's true and I tell him that I was just trying to get some lunch. He asked the officer what laws I had broken and they responded with some nonsense about harassment or something like that. My parents are called in and my mom tells the cops to get lost and that I didn't do anything wrong. But Karen kept insisting that I had been harassing her. Then one of the employees chirps in and starts to vouch for me. Eventually the cops leave and so do my parents. I get my lunch and my vice principal walks me back to school. I never ran into that lady after that, but I made sure to get lunch from that Tim's as often as I could. About 6 years ago, I worked for a power supply company in the UK. I worked in a small project team that coordinated all the company's major infrastructure projects, and the role required travel to meetings all over the country. We'd average around 8 miles a week in company miles over the year, depending on time of year and location of projects and so on. Someone in the finance department had reviewed our expense claims and calculated that over 1 quarter we'd not covered the required number of company miles to meet the company's policy on company cars. For that 1 quarter, without looking at any other data, we lost our company car entitlement and the company told us we had to return the fleet company at the end of their leases. Malicious compliance activated. As we were project engineers, we had a very particular set of skills for knowing how to follow rules to the letter and how to do so in a manner that benefited the company or project or individuals. Usually, if it benefited the company, it benefited all involved. This was not one of those occasions. We pay benefit in kind tax on our company cars in the UK. The rules around this changes as and when the government feels like it. My team had all carefully chosen our cars to be zero cost to ourselves by choosing cars that were below the allowance of £300 a month, so the remaining allowance covered the tax obligation. We'd all be screwed by the benefit in kind tax changes that year and we're now paying tax. So, for starters, we reviewed the company car policy and found the company had no way of stopping us handing our cars back with immediate effect, whilst the company was still responsible for the leases. So we all made arrangements for personal cars and handed our keys over at the next team meeting. We'd also reviewed the company travel policy. We started using hired cars and trains for traveling. Trains and hired cars in the UK are not cheap, as none of us were willing to use our personal cars and claim the 50 pence per mile. Usually, we'd work a long day and book a bit of overtime or leave to drive to and from meetings without staying over, as we would prefer to be at home even if it meant getting home late. That stopped with immediate effect. We'd only work the mandated 7.5-hour day, then stop booking into a hotel and take full advantage of the £25 food and drink allowance for dinner. Then work from home the following day as we'd been away from home the previous day, as per the policy. After about 8 weeks, we were called into a meeting with our line manager and department manager about our expenses. Our expenses for the first months after the cars had been returned were more than they were for the previous 12 months combined. Our line manager agreed that our expenses were in line with the policy, otherwise he wouldn't have signed them off. The department manager told us we were getting company cars back, and he expected the expenses to return to previous levels. We declined the offer of company cars and let management know we'll be adhering to the travel policy to the letter. Thank you for watching and see you next time.